Join me as I dive deep into the Bible to uncover what it really says about animal sacrifices. Let's see if we can make sense of all of it. You know, when I first started teaching the Bible, there was one aspect in the Old Testament that consistently confused me: animal sacrifices. What's up with an animal being killed on an altar? Why were the Hebrews commanded to do this? I mean, it all seemed pretty weird to me. What is the purpose for this sacrifice? Well, I was told back in those days that these animal sacrifices were a way for the Israelites to seek forgiveness for their sins and to restore their relationship with God. I would hear again and again that God required animal sacrifices to provide a temporary covering of sins. And because this forgiveness or covering of sins was temporary, the act of sacrificing an animal had to be repeated over and over. And I was told that these repeated animal sacrifices, well, they foreshadowed something better: the perfect and complete sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But honestly, it still really didn't make any sense to me. Two questions would not go away. How does an animal slain on an altar provide forgiveness for moral sin? And secondly, if Jesus were the perfect sacrifice that led to salvation, then how were these ancient Hebrews saved? Because obviously, Jesus was not around while they were living. Well, needless to say, this idea of animal sacrifices as a way for God to forgive moral sin, it was confusing. I could not make it add up and sound convincing in my head. So what did I do? Well, I did what probably many of you have done as well. I just tucked this concept of animal sacrifice deep inside my mind and tried to forget about it. But, as it always seems to be the case, God would not let me deep six this concept. I had to ask and answer the question: were animal sacrifices a way for Israelites to be temporarily forgiven of moral sin? Would the belief that I was taught concerning animal sacrifices stand up to what I actually read in the Old Testament? And what I discovered was the answer is no, it would not stand up. Animal sacrifices in the Old Testament had nothing to do with temporary forgiveness of moral sin. On closer inspection of the Old Testament text, what you will discover is that these animal sacrifices were offered as a way to atone sin, the atonement of sin. But what does that mean? What does it mean to atone sin? How did the ancient Hebrew understand atonement? Well, that's a good question. But before I answer that question, let me say this. If you're willing to take a closer look at what you really believe about the Bible, then make certain that you subscribe to this channel. I post a new video every week, and my aim is to challenge you, the viewer, to not be content with the status quo, but to actively pursue a greater understanding of what you believe about God's Word, the Bible. Okay, let's get back to this question. Were animal sacrifices a way for Israelites to be temporarily forgiven of moral sin? And more to the point, what was the relationship between animal sacrifices and Old Testament atonement? What was the purpose of sacrificing an animal to atone for sin? And what that really does is it brings us to the question, what is atonement? Well, you bring the word atonement up to the average believer, and what they'll generally tell you is that for most believers, this word atonement brings to mind a blood sacrifice that appeases God's anger or wrath toward sin. And because God is holy, his anger toward moral sinfulness is justified. Someone or something must pay for this moral failure. And this payment for moral sin is said to be accomplished through atonement by animal sacrifice. The moral failure must be atoned or paid for so that humans, and in this case ancient Hebrews, so they could be at one-ment with God. And that play on the word atonement, at one-ment, is seen as a theological end to being atoned. Sin is paid for by the animal sacrifice, and thus the ancient Hebrew is now one with God. But is what I just described regarding atonement actually taking place in the Old Testament? As Bible students, you and I need to ask ourselves the following questions. Was the moral sin of ancient Hebrews being paid for by animal sacrifices that they offered to God? And added to that question, was God's wrath being appeased by these animal sacrifices? And then we come to an even more important question. Does the Old Testament word atonement really mean at one-ment with God? In other words, when these animals were sacrificed, it meant that I, as an ancient Hebrew, could be now at one with God, in a right relationship, so to speak, with God. Well, to answer these questions, we're going to need to define that word atonement. The Hebrew word for atonement is kaper, and it means to cover, to cleanse, or to purify. In the Old Testament, atonement took place when a person was ritually cleansed or purified in anticipation of approaching the presence of God. Let me put it another way. Old Testament atonement concerned one's approach to sacred space, the space God occupied. It had nothing to do with becoming right with God or being forgiven of moral sinfulness. Now just take a moment and look at that statement. Old Testament atonement concerned one's approach to sacred space, the space God occupied. And this Old Testament atonement had nothing, please keep this in mind, it had nothing to do with becoming right with God or being forgiven of your moral sinfulness. Let me unpack this statement. In the first book of the Bible, we read that to be right with God involved personal faith or loyalty to God. Abraham's response to Yahweh in Genesis 15:6, it set the precedence, not only for those living at that time, but the reality is for everyone. It set the precedence for every human being. To have a relationship with God was not difficult. It was not hard. It was a faith relationship. It had to do with your faithfulness or your loyalty to Yahweh. This understanding of how to be right with God was established first with Abraham. Let me show you with a diagram. In this diagram, you'll note, you see the fellow there, that let's just let that guy represent Abraham, and he's looking up to a cloud. Let the cloud represent God or Yahweh. And then we see that pivotal verse in Genesis 15. Abraham believed the Lord, and he, that is the Lord, counted it to him, Abraham, as righteousness. When you're looking at that particular verse and you're looking at this picture, you'll note that Abraham's relationship with Yahweh is simply a faith relationship. Personal faithfulness or loyalty toward Yahweh made him right or righteous. He believed the Lord, or literally, he faithed the Lord, or he loyaled himself to the Lord, and God said, that is how it's done. That is right. Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord considered his response of faith as proof of genuine loyalty. And so Abraham lives in this relationship, constantly looking to God, his loyalty to God. Personal faith, or believing loyalty, has always been the way to know God. Abraham lived in a relationship with Yahweh by his faith or his loyalty alone. That faithfulness to Yahweh would then be the way that Abraham's descendants would also relate. They would relate to Yahweh by faith, whether it's Isaac, whether it's Jacob, or all the descendants of Abraham's family. Their belief in Yahweh was what the Lord considered proof of genuine loyalty. But this relationship with Yahweh would take a significant turn when Yahweh chose to dwell among the Israelites. And you got to catch this because it's very important. Things are going to change. The dynamic is going to change when Yahweh chooses to live among his people. Let's go back to that time when Moses has led the nation of Israel out of Egypt. He's brought them to Mount Sinai, where he's received the law of God. And the Lord then says to Moses, "And let them make a sanctuary that I might dwell in their midst." Let me show you another diagram. And again, we've got the same figure, only now this could be any Hebrew, if you will, looking up to the cloud, that cloud being Yahweh. But now we've introduced something here. Yahweh said, "Let them make me a sanctuary." Note the tent on the right side. "Let them make me a tabernacle that I may dwell in their midst." Now you have an entirely new thing being introduced into the relationship with this Hebrew. Earlier with Abraham, he simply walked in faith with Yahweh. But now Yahweh, as you see the arrow coming down to the tabernacle, this tent, is choosing to dwell among his people. Meaning that this Hebrew, if you'll see the dotted arrow, he's going to have to now come into presence, that is, into the presence of Yahweh living in this tabernacle. This is what's known as sacred space. And this Hebrew would be approaching sacred space. Now remember, being right with Yahweh is still faith. He's looking up, he's seeing Yahweh, he has believing loyalty toward Yahweh, but Yahweh has now chosen to dwell among these people. And the question arises, how then do I, as that Hebrew, approach a holy God now living in my midst? And keep in mind, as you're looking at this diagram, ancient religions taught that it was a dangerous act to enter sacred space. That is, the space that deity occupied. There was a dread associated with approaching that space that your God dwelt. You became before that God very carefully. So, how then does one approach sacred space? Because Yahweh is now living among his people. Yes, Yahweh is in heaven, so to speak, but Yahweh is now also on earth, living in the tabernacle. He told Moses, "Build me a sanctuary. I choose to dwell among you." And this, my friends, is where animal sacrifices come into play. To safely approach sacred space, that is, the space that God occupied, to approach this tabernacle, the person approaching, that is, that ancient Hebrew, they required atonement. As a Hebrew approached the tabernacle where God dwelt, he needed to be atoned or to be ritually purified. The Hebrew did not need to be saved, for he was already in a faith relationship with Yahweh. His faith, or his loyalty toward Yahweh, was evidenced by the fact that he was wanting to approach sacred space, the space in which Yahweh dwelt. No unbelieving person would ever have approached the tabernacle. Only the faithful, those already in covenant with Yahweh. And also, As a faithful or loyal Hebrew, he was already forgiven of moral sin. This was accomplished through his own personal confession of his moral sin to Yahweh. And because he was in covenant with Yahweh, he was forgiven by Yahweh. What the Hebrew needed, that is, this ancient Hebrew, he needed atonement. He needed to be ritually purified as he approached the tabernacle, as he came into presence of God or came into sacred space. It was at the altar then where this atonement or this ritual of purification would take place. Let me show you another diagram. We're building on the diagrams I've already showed you, and it's very important that you see. But in this particular one, you'll note that you have, again, the guy on the left side, the cloud, and again, the tent on the right side, that is the tabernacle. And then I've added a new piece, and that is there's a table in between the fellow and the tabernacle. Let that table represent the altar, because the altar is the place of sacrifice in which the ritually impure Hebrew could be ritually cleansed or forgiven, if you will, of his moral sin. Where he would be ritually cleansed but not forgiven of his moral sin. I don't want to confuse you here. Sometimes I get confused myself. You need to understand the whole thing that is going on here is that this Hebrew is approaching sacred space. He is now coming into the presence of God, and that's why he needed to be ritually purified, because he would be unclean before Yahweh, not morally sinful. That wasn't the issue going on here. And the offerings, those offerings that you see described in Leviticus, in those opening chapters of Leviticus, there are 5 of them: the burnt offering, the grain offering, peace offering, sin offering, and guilt offering. They were central to approaching sacred space, and they did not deal with moral sinfulness, but rather with ritual cleansing. The blood of that sacrifice had nothing to do with addressing moral sin or moral guilt. Now look at the verse that I provided for you in this diagram. It's from Leviticus 1, and it's dealing with the burnt offering. But I could, by the way, have chosen any of those different offerings because it's going to be the same. Note what you read. If his offering is a burnt offering, in other words, the fellow approaching sacred space, he shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. And it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him, or to cleanse him, or to purify him, to ritually cleanse him as he's coming in to the space that God occupies, as he's coming in to sacred space. This is what you see happening in this particular picture, that which is taking place. All right, so let's get over and look at these 5 offerings. And I think it'll help you understand of what's going on here. 5 offerings: the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. Let's look at these first 3. The burnt offering, which was the first of these you find in Leviticus 1, this particular offering was brought as a gift. This is how you need to think of it, as a gift to the entrance of the tabernacle. And it was noting that Yahweh accepts me. I'm going to spend time with you, Yahweh. So I'm bringing you a gift. I'm bringing a burnt offering. By the way, let me point out, in that description you read in Leviticus 1 regarding the burnt offering, the word sin does not show up anywhere because it's not dealing with moral sin. The second of these offerings was the grain offering. And please note, this doesn't have anything to do with blood at all. It's a cake. And it was brought before the tabernacle by the one coming as a memorial. It was symbolizing the fact that this Israelite is remembering, I am in covenant with Yahweh. And again, note, no blood sacrifice, not dealing with the word sin or moral sinfulness. And then the third of these offerings is the peace offering. And it is given or brought to show that all is well between me and my Lord, Yahweh. I am thankful for all that Yahweh has done for me. I am thankful that I am in covenant with my God. So these first three offerings, the word sin does not even show up in the descriptions. They're not dealing with moral sinfulness. These offerings were not given to earn salvation or to gain forgiveness for personal sin, that is, moral sin. They were brought to enhance the well-being of their relationship with Yahweh. Now that brings us to those final two offerings, the sin offering and the guilt offering. And this is where the misunderstanding regarding animal sacrifices comes from. It comes from these designations that are given to these particular offerings. And this is done by Bible translators. When you're reading in your translations, you will often have the heading sin offering and then guilt offering. And the very names themselves make you think, well, these two offerings appear as if they were sacrifices to remedy both moral sin and the moral guilt that came with it. But people, you need to understand, these two offerings had nothing to do at all with moral sin or guilt. Leviticus makes clear that both of these offerings dealt with, catch this, unintentional sin. These offerings had nothing to do with willful sin and the moral guilt that would follow. Their focus was any wrong that had been committed by the Hebrew unintentionally. Here is Yahweh instructing Moses about the law of the sin offering. And I'm reading in Leviticus 4. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about the things not to be done." So that raises the question, what is unintentional sin? Well, unintentional sin is the sin of ignorance. It is a wrong that is not premeditated or intentional. It's when a person would make an honest mistake. Now, the confusion for modern readers of the Bible is that when they see, and this could probably apply to you as well, and it certainly did for me, when I would see the phrase sin offering or the phrase guilt offering, it was extremely confusing. And it made me think that these sin offerings or these guilt offerings had to do with moral sinfulness. But as we're seeing, they have nothing to do with that. A better way to describe these offerings or to name them would be this: the purification offering and the reparation offering. The purification offering, which we understand as the sin offering, would be brought before the tabernacle when ritual purification was needed if a Hebrew had sinned unintentionally. That is, he had made an honest mistake that caused him to be unclean. An example of this would be, well, let's say you're a farmer, you're a Hebrew farmer, and one of your animals dies, and you need to bury that carcass, that dead animal. But you mistakenly, unintentionally touch the dead flesh of that animal, which in Levitical law would cause you to become unclean. What was the remedy? Purification offering. That's how it worked. This would be true across the board for all unintentional sin. And then the second of these that we know is the guilt offering, which is better called the reparation offering. It would be brought before the tabernacle if you, the Hebrew, had misused or broken something related to the tabernacle itself, causing you then to become unclean. And the remedy? Well, it was the reparation offering. And note, that both of these offerings were brought to decontaminate sacred space. And I'm going to show you why. When this Hebrew would approach the tabernacle, or later, when it was a permanent structure, the temple, because all of what I'm talking about now has direct application for the temple itself centuries later, but we're talking about the tabernacle. When that Hebrew would approach the tabernacle, he would be unclean. He's needing to be ritually purified. And if he didn't, he would then contaminate sacred space. Let me read again from Leviticus 4 concerning someone who is now bringing the purification offering. And the anointed priest shall take some of the blood of the bull and bring it into the tent of the meeting. In other words, this person has brought a bull and it's been sacrificed. He's bringing it in regards to himself, and the priest is now taking that blood, as we read in Scripture, and he's bringing it into the tent of meeting. And note what the priest does. And the priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle part of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. Please note what he's doing. This Hebrew has brought the blood of a bull. The priest has now brought it inside the tabernacle. He's dipped his finger in the blood, and he sprinkles that blood in front of the veil of the sanctuary. Please note that the blood of these offerings was never applied to the one bringing the offering, but to the entrance and the furniture of the sanctuary. That is, those things that were inside the tabernacle itself. And what it was doing, it was decontaminating or purifying sacred space from the unintentional sin of the unclean Hebrew who brought the offering and had now come into the presence of this sacred space. And again, please note, these 5 offerings had nothing to do with what the Bible called high-handed sin. That is, sins that were committed intentionally, bringing with them moral guilt. If one were to commit, for say, adultery or murder, there was no sacrifice for those sins at all. For this reason, we read in Hebrews, "For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." The reason why the writer of Hebrews is saying that is because the blood of bulls and goats, these animals, that is, the animals that are sacrificed in these 5 Levitical offerings, they were never used as a way to obtain forgiveness for moral sin and moral guilt. That is not how the Hebrew was forgiven, and that was not their purpose. Forgiveness by God for moral sin was given on the basis of God's grace and mercy. The Israelite in covenant with Yahweh, faithful, loyal to Yahweh, could be on good terms with Yahweh through his faith, his faithfulness. And that Israelite knew that Yahweh would forgive him provided he was in covenant with Yahweh. This is why King David, following his high-handed sin of adultery and murder, wrote this, "For you, that is Yahweh, you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise." Note, David's saying, I would bring a sacrifice if that would make matters better, but it won't. What you're looking for is honesty on my part to admit I'm the one that messed up, and you're going to receive me on that basis. So let's get back to the question of where we started. Were animal sacrifices a way for an Israelite to be temporarily forgiven of his moral sin? And the answer is no. The animal sacrifices, that is, those 5 Levitical offerings, they concerned a Hebrew's approach to sacred space, the space that God occupied. An Hebrew coming into the presence where God lived, if you will, where God's presence was known, and in this case it's the tabernacle, he did not want to contaminate that sacred space. He would then offer whatever offering he's bringing, but in particular the sin offering and the reparation offering or guilt offering, if you will, they would then decontaminate him so that he would not contaminate sacred space. These offerings, they were not offered by the Hebrew to get himself into a right relationship with Yahweh. He already was in that relationship with Yahweh based on his faithfulness, his believing loyalty to Yahweh. When an ancient Hebrew brought a sacrifice, an offering, he did so because as a mortal, he was coming into sacred space where Yahweh dwelt. And you need to understand, animal sacrifices were a part of Old Testament atonement. They concerned one's approach to sacred space where God dwelt, not with becoming right with God or being forgiven of moral sinfulness. And when you get it and see it, then all of a sudden these animal sacrifices make sense. You understand now why God commanded them to be brought, because God chose back in that time to dwell in their midst. And for that ancient Hebrew to approach the space that God occupied, sacred space, he needed to be ritually purified. This is atonement. This is what animal sacrifices were all about. Well, listen, I do hope this has been helpful. I know we've covered a lot of turf, and you may need to re-listen or review this video again and again because it takes a while to really hear this stuff, to get it into your thinking, because so much of what you've been taught regarding animal sacrifices, well, truthfully, the Old Testament's not teaching often what you've been taught. So it takes a little bit of time to turn that around. So I would encourage you to re-watch this video, because the more you do, you're going to start to see some things. And listen, if it's been helpful, take a moment to hit that like button. And again, if you've not subscribed, then hit the subscription button as well. In any comments, let me hear from you. Again, I love to hear from you. And also those who are watching this video, they enjoy reading your comments as well. So thanks for taking the time. And as always, God's very best to you.